Listen. Ready, theme.
Good evening. For your information tonight.
All of the women that I was sort of tracking in that book are all kind of sidelined out. Betty was just fired from her, she got one of the first national talk shows ever. She was the next big thing, and then they just didn't know what to do with her and ended up firing her after a year. Imagine firing Betty White.
Hi, this is Lauren Milberger.
And this is Jessie Mullins.
And welcome to another interview episode.
Y'all, we are so excited
about this interview. Excited about this interview.
A little peek into how the sausage is made. We originally were going to have this interview earlier.
Oh, yes, months ago.
The strike happened. So we have been anxiously, we were already excited to have this interview because we've been waiting to talk to this particular human, but then we had to wait even longer. So if you hear the excitement in our voices in this interview, that is why. So without continuing to be, and so instead of leading you all along ambiguously, our guest today is Jennifer Keishin Armstrong.
Jennifer is a pop culture journalist and has written several books on pop culture, but she's previously worked for Entertainment Weekly. And her book that we're going to be mostly focusing on is When Women Invented Television, which is this amazing book about 4 women at the beginning of television, including Betty White, including women that you may not have heard of that we are so excited to introduce you to, at a time when it was just beginning. And it was such a fascinating read that we were so excited to talk to her about this. Now, what's also amazing is that Jennifer has very similar interests as we do, as she has written on a lot of other 90s television shows. She has written about Sex and the City. She has written about Seinfeld. And then also in a way that many people have suggested is parallel to Murphy Brown is she's written a wonderful book on Mary Tyler Moore. So I just want to clarify in this episode, I mentioned a book called Red Channels. For those who are not familiar, Red Channels was the book that we were referencing that came out with all the names of people who supposedly were communists during the blacklist.
As you may predict, we could have talked to her for hours longer than we did. We hope to be able to chat with her again soon because we have so many other things we want to talk about. But I think the thing that you will hear in her voice that we got to witness over video was that every time she got a chance to talk about one of these 4 women that she features in her book, her face lit up like they were her best friends and beloved members of her family. It's really just so infectious to see the love that she had for these women as she researched them and the lasting impact that they had on this art form we know as television.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then we were also lucky enough because of the delay in our interview that Jennifer has a new book that's out right now called So Fetch, The Making of Mean Girls and Why We're Still So Obsessed with It.
The stars aligned. It was a very fun conversation about everything and beyond. So we really hope you enjoy it.
Yes, enjoy. Will the mystery guest please sign in?
I am Jennifer Keishin Armstrong, and I am the author of several books about television history with a large emphasis, I would say, on women and comedy.
Yes, which is one of the main reasons we were really excited about having you on today.
We got very excited when we heard the title of When Women Invented Television.
I'm so glad because that book, I love that book.
Good.
We love to do origins here. What would you say started your love of television?
It's really hard to say. That's a good question, but I don't totally know the answer because it just goes back so far. The story I always tell is just that I remember being a little kid and we would get TV Guide, the print in the mail. And I was so into it. I would get it every week and immediately read it, read the articles. And then I would circle the things I was going to watch that week. It was that, and I was pretty young then. I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there. So it's very hard to know. I guess we were just a TV family. Mm-hmm. And so that must have been a huge part. I do have memories of watching things like Rhoda or, Newhart with my parents as a family.
Yes, I had a very specific highlight and star pattern for
nice
articles versus what I wanted to see on the actual guide itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, from the beginning, I was reading the articles and eventually it occurred to me someone wrote them and that could be me. But that was not when I was 5, but probably by the time I was 8. So
I was going to say, when did you first conceptualize television as a thing people made. Do you have a memory of that moment?
Not totally. I wish I was like, oh, this one episode of this one show or whatever. But I do remember pretty early also noticing like the credits, you know, and starting to notice who made things. One of the earlier ones that I remember and like had a feeling about was Marcy Carsey. You remember Marcy Carsey?
Sure, yeah.
Who I actually met last year. But I'm so excited, like, because I was like, it's a special group of people who would like be excited that I was in a room with Marcy Carsey.
Yes, that's us.
You two are two of them. So I mean, obviously her name rhymes. And so that's part of it, that just like as a kid, you're just like, oh, that's funny. But I remember really quickly, you know, first being like, oh, her name rhymes, but then being like, oh, she's a girl, like, right? Like that's a woman. And that really struck me, you know, and that was exciting to me because I was so aware that so many of, you know, that's in the 80s sitcom world where like, it's just by default going to be a bunch of dudes. So that was very exciting to me that she was a woman, and that kind of was around the time I started to notice, you know, her and any other women who might be in the credits of shows that I liked.
No, that sounds very familiar to our experience, I think. And that's one of the connections that I know I personally, and I think Jesse would agree, to Murphy Brown, is to see a woman's name in the credits, to see, oh, who's Diane English? Oh, she created this. Oh, she's writing this. Oh, she's show running this.
Yes.
And understanding what
she's in
showrunner is.
advertisements.
Yes. Yes. So, the 80s and 90s is also when we have kind of the nameplate, well, the word showrunner, right? Like, obviously showrunner is more of a 90s term, but I mean, sure, we have Norman Lear. I feel like there are very few, like, I want to say Aaron Sorkin, but that's obviously later, that's the 2000s, but to have someone who is recognizable, because I would say that Marcy Carsey is amazing, but I don't know what she looks like.
Yeah. That's true.
But it also, I think, depends on the showrunner. I would also say that I didn't know what Amy Sherman Palladino looked like until the DVDs came out. Now, would you say that there were particular shows that you look back on in your childhood that cemented your love of television?
I mean, the Mary Tyler Moore Show and Rhoda. Like, I actually, you know, I think I figured out that, like, I couldn't have been watching the Mary Tyler Moore Show from the beginning live because I wasn't alive yet. So I didn't know at the time though, right? So like I was, you know, watching Rhoda. I remember we were into like, you know, we would do Carlton the Doorman and all of that in my house. And like I kind of remember watching that with my parents, and I just absolutely like loved Rhoda, the person and the show. Like I was so enamored of her. I would wear like headscarves and flowy dresses. I have a picture of myself where I know that I believe I am dressed as Rhoda. I mean, you would never, if you saw it, you would not know what I was doing. But like I'm wearing my mom's nightgown and a headscarf, and I'm little. Like I'm a little tiny, like I'm maybe 2 or 3, and very proud of myself in that photo. And so I'd say like that. And then I think that kind of retroactively got me into Mary Tyler Moore Show reruns. Those are probably the earliest. And like I even remember like Newhart. Clearly we were, I mean, and also All in the Family and all of that. But weirdly, I got into All in the Family more as reruns later. I have a very specific memory of being more like 12 or 13 or 14. And I think it's because it was so political, so overtly political, that it like caught my attention that time. Like obviously we'd watched it before and I knew about it, but like I started rewatching it in some kind of syndicated reruns, and I was like, oh, now I understand what this show is. And I also remember very specifically that we always said in my household that Archie and Edith were so much like my grandparents. So both of those things like really got me into that. And then that's when I was like, oh, this is more of like me starting to become like a student of television, where then I was like, who's Norman Lear? What's going on here? Like, oh, now I understand that Maude and the Jeffersons are part of this too. And it's all the same person, you know, like, and then getting into that, all of that nerdy stuff of like wanting to understand who was making it and what was special about it and what was distinctive about his, you know, Norman Lear's style and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think also from a childhood standpoint, we talk a lot about as being young women watching Murphy Brown and how we would want to dress like these characters and so on. I think, you know, in defense of Rhoda, half of the Rhoda cosplay is just personality. So as long as the essence was there.
Exactly. And I mean, I do in retrospect, I see that there's a lot to be seen in, like, I also have a very distinct memory of I would play Mary and Rhoda when I was very little.
Oh, I
And
love
this
it.
is, here's how that works is Mary is where I go get my dad's briefcase and I open it up and I get the like office supplies out. And Rhoda is where I wear the headscarf and the flowy dress. And I think that's so significant because that's taking the place of like playing house.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm 5 and I'm seeing something, it's like, obviously I don't really understand. I'm not like, oh, this is interesting because it's the first, independent single woman on television. And that's why I'm 5. I can't figure out all of that. I just saw those women and was like, those women are so cool. I want to be like that, right? That's what I was seeing. And I think I was also seeing like, oh, they're different from the other women on television. They're not moms. Like, yes, I know I can play house too. And I did. I totally did. And I played Barbie and all of that stuff. But like the fact that I made up my own thing to play Mary and Rhoda at a very young age and that is Mary goes to an office and works. And Rhoda is kind of like cool hippie chick. Like seems significant to me.
I think something I found particularly interesting in When Women Invented Television was looking at almost in this time, and this also I think coincides with third wave feminism, something we've talked about a lot with Murphy, but was almost watching the creation of a new archetype within television, within female representation in television. I'd be intrigued as you talk about, seeing the office, the woman of the office, the hippie woman, what types of archetypes you have seen existing in the representation of women in television from your childhood to now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and obviously that was why I was responding so much to Mary and Rhoda in that moment, is just knowing, like instinctively knowing they were different, right? Because before that, it really is pretty much wives and mothers. It's really, and it's like, and even within that, you get Bewitched, or you get, it's like you get little differences. I remember really loving Bewitched too when I was a kid, the
I
reruns.
watched that in reruns. I loved
and
it.
kind of also understanding it was a little bit. It's like obviously it's not as different as something like the Mary Tyler Moore Show, but it's like I got that she at least had magic. But yeah, really before that, it's like you really did not, even like my women of When Women Invented Television, who are really inventing television in the late 40s and early 50s. It's like, they're wives and mothers. Like that's who they are on television. Like that, it didn't even, I don't think it occurred to anyone, which is funny because, Betty, for instance, was sort of like famously and defiantly single at that time.
Yeah.
And it like I never saw any evidence that it occurred to anyone that maybe that like she would have a sitcom where she played a single woman. Like part of it is, of course, that her sitcom came out of her doing some sketches on the morning show that she co-hosted, and that it came from a sketch where they were playing husband and wife. But like it just did not occur to anyone anywhere that like maybe this should be about Betty's rockin' single life. No, this is like she was just a very cute wife. They didn't have kids on that show, so that was a little different. But like, I think that was more of a budget thing, to be honest. Just like it was mostly a two-hander with some guest stars occasionally. And, Gertrude Berg, who kind of starred in and wrote the first successful family show on television, she is like the quintessential Jewish mother on that show. And that is why she was successful. I think it would have just blown everyone's minds. Like you could never have had a single woman as a main character at that time. It just doesn't, it would not compute on any level. Because what are you doing being single still? You're 23.
You spinster, you.
Yeah, like that would freak everyone out so much. I mean, just like Betty, we saw evidence that in interviews when Betty would do them and she was 30, she was like more like 28, 29, and people were completely freaked out by the fact that she did not have a husband. So, and if you did, if you were single like her, you lived at home with your parents. So like, was just not, there was no Mary Tyler Moore figure anywhere to be found. And so that is, it's like, once you know all of that, it's like you understand more why the Mary Tyler Moore Show was such a big deal, for instance. But even like Murphy Brown going into, it's like, even in the 80s and 90s, it was still a pretty big deal to have these kinds of women. Designing women also comes to mind when I think about these kinds of things. And, having other kinds of women besides the mother of a household was still a pretty big deal until like not that long ago.
Well, it's amazing the amount of time from what your book establishes to actual change. Like it didn't just happen in a couple decades. It took a lifetime.
Yeah, and
it's really long.
I think a lot of what your book reminded me of is sort of the early days of silent film, where you had so many women who were pioneering and directing and producing, and no one had a problem with it. And then all of a sudden, either because it became so popular or men realized that they could do it, they sort of disappeared and it became an oddity.
Yeah, I mean, the joke I make over and over again is if you see women doing something, it's because men have either not gotten there yet or they've already been there. Right? You get like things like the first female anchor after men are like, yeah, no one's watching network television anymore. You know what I mean? Like, or they're not there yet. And that's what happened with early television. Is just like it was all speculative. We didn't know there was money to be made. We hadn't gotten to a critical mass of people with television yet. So that was the best time for women to run in there and stake some claim and maybe just hope. I'm not even sure they were being that like calculated. They just kind of saw an opening.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, I'm in radio and that's crowded. So maybe I try it encouraged them they had better reasons to take that chance than men did who were established and had a good thing going. So I dated it to about 1955 that things really, like I saw that essentially that's when what we think of the 50s on television happened basically in 1955. And that's just because there was a critical mass of people in America with televisions. There was money to be made, and I would say also there's a, coordinating like conservative wave that's been coming since the end of World War II that really sort of starts to crest there. So all of those things together just become like, that's when the men just like walk into the boardrooms of television and they're like, thanks, well, we've got it from here. And that's really when you sort of start to see that all of the women that I was sort of tracking in that book through different mysterious forces, are all kind of sidelined out of television one way or another, whether they're just like Betty was just fired from her, she got one of the first national talk shows ever. And she was the next big thing. And then they just didn't know what to do with her and ended up firing her after a year. Imagine firing Betty White.
God.
That story is so frustrating to read, especially with hindsight.
Yeah,
but one of the things I appreciate about the way that you cover it is it feels very present as you're reading it. And just to think about being in that position, I mean, it's throwing me into watching the most recent season of Julia. And this idea of what's happening as women are entering the workforce. And you see the male cohort in risk assessment mode, realizing the good thing that they have and what's challenging it, what's worth pioneering now that's already been pioneered for them.
Yeah, exactly. It also lessons in chemistry reminded me a lot of this too. That, that was, I thought, a pretty good portrayal of the similar thing where it's like they don't know what to do because it's like they know somebody is good at what they're doing on screen, but they also are sort of confused and annoyed by it. Essentially, like they don't get it when it's not made for them. And then some of the other women were blacklisted or blacklisted by proxy. In the case of Gertrude, her co-star was blacklisted and that screwed her up so badly.
It's such a sad story.
Yeah, it's really bad.
Would you like to maybe talk a little bit about that for people who maybe aren't familiar with Philip Loeb?
Yeah. So Gertrude Berg, as I mentioned, she had this very successful at the beginning family show called The Goldbergs. And it's exactly what it sounds like. It's not the current Goldbergs, but it's a Jewish family in a tenement in the Bronx. But it's very much, a pioneering version of the family show we now are very familiar with. You have to remember they actually didn't know what that looked like. So at the time they were making it up. But it's very much a living room, for the most part, show where families work out stuff. And it's really fun to watch, especially in the early days. It's really the stuff that you can get. It's so fun. And it is fun partly because it is the family show we know, but also at times it goes a completely different direction than you think because of the fact that like it doesn't know the tropes yet. And it's also a very Jewish family, you know, in the city. That's something that was very, you know, unique at the time. And her husband was played by Philip Loeb, this actor who was also very much an early labor activist in the industry. And I was thinking about him a lot in the last year with the strikes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean, he really pioneered a lot of that stuff. He really actually was in the room and involved with getting a lot of the, you know, protection, the original protections. People don't realize, like, it used to just be Wild West. Like, it used to be just like exploit the crap out of your actors and pay them nothing. And, you know, people didn't have benefits. They didn't have all of this stuff. And he was really part of the group that was responsible for making it sometimes a livable profession. And that turned around to bite him, as of course it does sometimes. There was a blacklist there was a wave of blacklist. I was going to say there's a blacklist that came out, which is kind of true. It's just like a very weird thing that the way this thing would work. Yeah. But in this case, there was this publication that came out that purported to list, quote, possible communists. It's just like maybe these people are, we're not sure.
Let's ruin someone's life. Maybe.
Yeah, but just like, here's an
allegedly.
Right. And they would say that, like when people would be like, is this it? Why do you think this is okay? They're like, well, we said, you know, who knows, but maybe. And unfortunately, the maybe was enough to get a lot of people fired. And it was just
risk
fear.
assessment.
Yep. It's just fear. It was, no one ever said they were not going to watch the Goldbergs because Philip Loeb was on it. It was just like the fear of possible boycotts and things. And I think they were always weighing this stuff, right? It's like, well, is he that important? Maybe we can just get rid of him, you know, that kind of thing. And so I always wonder if they would have taken out Gertrude. It's just interesting that she was not on the list, but he was, because she was more powerful. But anyway, you know, she tried to save him for a while. Like, she refused to fire him, even though her sponsors were asking her to. And so she was trying to negotiate behind the scenes to stay on the air and also keep him. And they just were not budging on it. And this kept them off the air for a while. And at a critical time, particularly because the next season, what was supposed to happen is that they were going to be paired with a new show called I Love Lucy. And really what's funny about that is that at the time, of course, it's almost as if like I Love Lucy was the unproven entity there. Like, they were thinking like, oh, the Goldbergs is really going to help this I Love Lucy get off the ground. But in any case, Lucy was an immediate hit. And think of how much we would know who Gertrude was if that were true. And you know how this is. You can't just take a show off the air for a couple seasons and expect it, especially at this time when it's so, you know, no one's sure what's going on and everything. And at a time when, of course, obviously it's appointment viewing. We don't have DVRs. It's 1949. Like, you know, it's like, we really don't, you know, you had to watch it. You had to know when it was on. And the minute it's gone, it's out of people's heads. And so I really think, you know, this show had been so popular. It was the first show that was ever turned into a movie. They were really like riding high. And then all of a sudden this happened and cut the momentum. And she was trying to make it all work. And then she finally gave in after a little bit, ended up having to go to another network, got another network to say they'd put the show on, but they would only, there's a lot of machinations, but essentially the bottom line was they ended up saying, we'll only do it if Philip Loeb is fired. And she finally, her reasoning for giving in was just that she employed many people and she didn't want to keep them waiting anymore. And I really believe too, this is this woman's entire life's work. I mean, this was on radio first for almost 2 decades. So like, she brings it to television and now all of a sudden, you know, her entire life's work is threatened. And she does employ a bunch of other people. And so she finally just said, you know, she entered an agreement to essentially keep paying him as long as the show was on. But, replacing him with someone else. I mean, there's sort of this sweet thing where like she goes to replace him and like she doesn't like any of the actors, which I think is very psychological.
Yeah.
Like she went through like every actor in Hollywood and was like, no. And it's because they had really nice chemistry, and you can't also
it's
just
very sweet,
screw that up and expect someone else. She had at least two other Philip, or his name was not Philip, at least two other TV husbands. And none of them worked that well. And it was funny also to watch. I mean, funny, sad. Some of the episodes where they first come back and she has the new husband, like she writes so little dialogue for this poor man. Like she clearly does not really want him there. There's even a joke at some point. Like they actually do a meta joke at some point where he's like, well, I never get to talk anymore or something like that. And yeah, it just never worked again. It never worked the same. The show wasn't the same. People weren't as interested in it, and it just lost its mojo. And from there, like he ended up dying by suicide, and it was pretty accepted at the time and historically that it was essentially a suicide because of the blacklist.
Yeah.
Like that is how that has been recorded in history, and it seems pretty clear that that's true because he couldn't get work anymore.
And didn't he have an ill son that he needed to take care of?
He did. He had a mentally ill son who he was paying he was in a mental hospital because that was how things definitely went then. And he really was starting to struggle by then. He was having his own health issues, and he was trying to pay his son's bills. And he was like on a touring production of, that's where he ended up, is kind of like on touring productions of plays because that was the only place he could get hired. And, that's a hard life too. So yeah, he was sort of like at this high in that first 2 seasons of the Goldbergs in the movie. And then it just disintegrated because of the blacklist.
Yeah, I first learned about Gertrude Berg through Philip Loeb because the Actors Equity had a talk about him on the anniversary of his death. Because not that it has any justification, the blacklist, but if you look at the things that Philip Loeb was fighting for, it was running water. It was having a cot, which, actors joke about, oh, we got the equity cot, a place to rest because they were there for so long. And so many people, John Garfield, people whose lives were ruined because of this ridiculous red channels. But it introduced me to Gertrude Berg, who I knew nothing about. And knowing the breadth of her career through radio and television, and something I think that many people who are listening may not understand, that she wrote every episode, and on radio there were 46 episodes a year almost, which is... Like, how can you fathom that many episodes? I think there's a picture of her, right, with all of the scripts sort of stacked up on top of each other. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. She was an amazing individual. And what I find compelling in your book is how you show how difficult it was for her to make that decision and how she fought against it and how she just really seemed to feel like she had no choice in the end to save the show and save people's jobs.
Exactly. And this is something you can imagine because I was like, this is the crux of what I wanted to get at. This was a huge, huge dramatic moment. It's like the moment of her life. You know what I mean? Yeah. And she was such a controlling person which, is what it is. Like, that's how she got where she was. Mm-hmm. And she was so in control, especially of her outward, like what people knew about her and what people saw of her, that she just did not talk about this. Her grandchildren who I interviewed said like, yeah, you don't talk about this. And one of the most fascinating things to me is that she wrote an autobiography in which she completely skips over it.
Wow. It must have been so painful.
She mentions him.
Yeah.
Like she just and Philip Loeb was my husband and he was great and blah, blah, blah. And then just goes right past it in the timeline, the actual, all of the stuff. So I worked really hard to try to get as much as I could about what had gone on because I was so convinced, I know she didn't just throw him under the bus.
Yeah.
Because there is this pause, right? So it's like, so it's something in between. Mm-hmm. I was able to find things like there's an NBC archive where there were some memos, which was where she was when she was at first at CBS, and then after they, the whole blacklisting thing worked, and NBC was the one that picked them up, and they kind of had some good behind the scenes stuff. And, but it was so hard to figure out, like, there definitely is no record of how she felt about, for instance, his death. None. And obviously, like, you can surmise, I'm sure she was devastated, but she's never actually, like, the only evidence we have of how she felt is the fact that she wouldn't talk about it. Her archive is fairly devoid of this. There is one folder where she has all of the clippings about the Philip Loeb thing, and then there's nothing else. So it's just, like, very interesting to see how she even curated her life, which I think is also something these women, all four of my women and When Women Invent Television, really meticulously curated their image in different ways. And for her, this was a huge part of that. And I just take it as, like, no, I'm supposed to be Molly Goldberg, this happy Jewish mother. Like, that's what people want from me. There's no sadness. That's not what we're doing here.
It makes me think a lot about, obviously we are currently in this day and age of knowing more about people than we probably need to. And also this idea of the holding of one's trauma, of choosing whether or not you let people in on that, I'm sure was probably part of it as well. But something you made me think about when you talk about your women and about some of the parallels that we have, something for us in Murphy Brown that's very important is talking about intersectionality. And the story of Hazel Scott and McCarthyism along these lines. I would love to hear you talk about the choice to include her story and talk about her.
Yeah, I mean, so I knew I was going to do 4, and my idea was kind of like pick 4 of different kinds. And this was obviously, I wanted a woman of color, because that's really, not just based on, like, 2020's rules, but also it was not just women, but people of color who really saw the opportunity, the sort of gold rush opportunity early in television. There's actually, like, more diversity earlier too, which is so wild. But I definitely wanted to have a woman of color. And so there were several. And I mean, she's just so hard to resist in a lot of ways. She was so glamorous. Like, oh, she's so cool. Like, she's just,
she
like,
really is, like, even just pictures, you're like, wow.
Yeah, like I'm loving that you're introducing me to this person, but I'm also so sad that, like, she has been lost to time because she seemed so amazing.
As the kids would say, she's now my Roman Empire.
Yes, that's the thing. I had like analogs for a lot of these just to sort of explain them to current people, to modern people. And I always said, like, Gertrude is kind of like an Oprah figure because she was such a, like, great, she wrote and directed and starred and created and produced and all of that. But she also had, like, a line of house dresses and a cookbook, and, like, she understood brand extension. Whereas I always say that Hazel is like Beyonce. And,
yes.
Right? Like, that's not, because it's not only that she's glamorous and beautiful and a musician. She was a jazz musician and very political. She was a civil rights activist, early civil rights activist, and was married to Adam Clayton Powell, who was a congressman. And so they were kind of this, like, crazy power, like, such a glamorous power. He's very handsome too.
They're so hot. Like, just
they were like the hottest couple. So and, like, there were, like, crowds outside the, church when they got married in Harlem, and they were on the cover of Ebony, like, all the time. There was this great article that was just, like, a picture of him, and it was like, my life with Hazel Scott. And it was all, like, for this sort of, like, as told to first person. And weirdly, especially for a congressman, like, very sort of personal and revealing in the sense of, like, they're building a very specific image of, like, she makes chocolate cake, but she also looks hot. And there was this one time when we were going to go to a concert, and let me tell you, we did not even get there. Like, one of those kinds of where you're like, is this like, this is just published? Like,
pop culture politics, I'm in.
Yeah. It's so strange, but it's so, like, Jay-Z and Beyonce, right? That it's like, I think that's actually very calculated, right? It's all in service of course, their own images, but also their activism and showing, like, this strong Black couple. They had a child at the time of her television show. They had a small child, and she was super glamorous, and so she got this show because that was what happened a lot at the time. Is the musicians would have what they'd call a variety show, and it was mostly them performing, but then they'd occasionally have like guests in and friends and stuff like that. It's kind of fun. I wish we did more of that now. And so hers was sort of set in this, her set looked like kind of like a penthouse apartment in New York City, very well appointed. And she's at a piano. And one of her tricks is that she'd sometimes play like two pianos at once.
Yeah.
So she'd do that sometimes on the show.
So
she had
cool.
a backing band, and it was doing really well. Like it started in local in New York City 1 night a week, expanded to like 3 nights a week because it was doing so well, and then expanded nationally. And all of the reviews, like this is a weird thing, but I guess you kind of think of it now as like bloggers. The trade magazines would actually review like most episodes of a show. They'd give you like a little recap and tell you how it was. Even something like her just playing the piano, they would just sort of tell you. And so they really tracked shows, which was lucky for me because there's no recordings of the show.
Yeah.
So the only way I know what happened is their meticulous kind of descriptions of it. But it was doing really well. In every review I read, people loved it and wanted more and all of this stuff. And then, she also ended up on the same list as Philip Loeb, which was so her show ran for like about a year in 1950. And then this list happened, and that was it. I mean, that was kind of like, despite the fact that it was doing really well, we can never know the alternate histories of these shows, right? It's shocking to me how much it seems almost as if these networks left money on the table, at least to my modern eyes. I could be totally wrong, and maybe these shows would have gotten reamed for having suspected communists on them. But they were so scared of this idea that they killed 2 of their most popular shows on the sheer fear. Again, as I said before, no one was actively like boycotting them. They may have gotten like 1 letter from somebody somewhere. But people were not, this was not like a thing that was definitely going to happen. It was just the idea that it might. And maybe they felt as if, they were already taking a chance on a Black woman. But, she was actually like the first Black person, male or female, to have a primetime network show of their own. So that's huge. But maybe that still made them a little bit nervous. And so she was blacklisted. And then the problem with her, which I think is a good problem, the reason she's so extra cool is that she was like, oh no, this is not okay. And so she just went to Washington and gave them a piece of her mind. They did not want to see her. They tried to not see her, the committee that was in charge of this. And then she called a press conference and was like, they won't see me.
That's my favorite.
And remember, she's a congresswoman's congressman's wife. So now they've got a problem. So I'm fine, she can come. And she gave this incredible speech, but who knows? I don't want to say it didn't help her cause, but I doubt that it helped. Sure. It was no help in keeping her show on the air. But I think it was a really cool thing to do. Like, imagine that a Black woman went before those like Strom Thurmond-y people, this big committee of white men, and explained to them what they were doing wrong. I mean, it's incredible. And the short version of the story, there's some stuff, there's a bunch of drama, but basically in the end, she ends up leaving the country because she's just like, screw this, these people are idiots. Between the racism and the anti-communism, I can't. And so she just moved to Paris after she split up with Adam Clayton Powell, who was his own project. And so that was that. And that, I think, is a huge reason why we don't know who she is now, is because she didn't just get blacklisted. She also just left the country and was like, I have other things to do. So she had like a pretty, she had some difficulties, but she also had a pretty nice life in Paris for a while. Eventually came back and performed in America before she died. But, I think, again, you can't just cut people off in this, like when they're on their upward trajectory, because you can't just get it back.
Yeah.
It's when it's time, it's time. And if you cut them off during it, that's it. And that's why we don't know about these two huge, important women.
Now, I'm curious, do you think that she was put on the blacklist because she was a woman of color, or a retribution against her husband, or because she was against segregation? I mean,
I think all of the above, probably. I mean, it's just, you know, there's an awful lot of marginalized people on that list. Like, if you're Jewish, if you're Black, if you're a woman, that ups your chances. And definitely, like, so also notice, like, so her, and if you think about her and Philip Loeb, right? It's like, he's Jewish, she's a Black woman. Both are activists in different ways. So they're both like troublemakers. They both have FBI files. I did get her FBI files. And, you know, that at that time, you can't overstate kind of the sort of hype around all of this stuff, you know? And it's also, I always like to remind everyone that it was not and still is not technically against the law to be a communist. It's so strange because, like, both of these people denied being, quote, communist. And it's like, how would you even define that? But, like, also you are totally allowed to be, you know, technically speaking. So it, you know, that too, it's like, even if they were, that shouldn't take away. That's just like a belief system. That's not, you know, that's not against the law. They were not committing treason of any kind. So, you know, I do think that it was really easy to then use this kind of list.
Yeah.
And maybe they didn't even, the people making it, maybe they didn't even realize they were doing it per se, but they're like, that looks like a communist to me, right? It's like, yeah, isn't it suspicious that, you know, yeah. Like, think of now when you have conspiracy theories about like the Illuminati or whatever, and how people, for instance, very much have, you know, like famously wielded it against Jay-Z and Beyonce. She mentions it in a song, like, because there's a reason. And the reason is people are like, well, it's awfully suspicious that those two Black people are so powerful. So something else must be going on, you know, and how can we take them down? And I think both that gets you on the list, and then it also like doesn't get you the benefit of the doubt, so that when advertisers are nervous and looking at this stuff, they just go like, we were worried to begin with. Now we're really worried. This isn't worth the trouble.
Oh, there's such an implication of the people who are used to being in power. And both this idea of like, well, we didn't give them this much power, so how did they get it? It must be something nefarious. But also, even then, this idea of these folks in marginalized identities is, well, you should just be happy that we let you have this to begin with. Right. How dare you also be mouthy? And by doing so, challenge our power.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, they were very much, you know, there's a lot of kind of people coming for Adam Clayton Powell too. I don't think that they were being paranoid when they believed that they were being bugged while they were on vacation and stuff like that. Totally. In fact, their son tells this story about like them believing they were being bugged while on vacation and then opening a door and being like, there they are. Like there's the people listening to us. Like this, if you look at history, we now know, like think of like MLK, Byron Rustin, all of those people. Who we now just accept. We're just like, of course they were, you know, the FBI was gunning for them and
we know they
trying to get everything they could. We just know this. And ACP was right in there. And therefore his wife, who, you know, was this enormous figure in and of herself.
Now, one of the women that you write about that I was also surprised about, who I had never heard of because of the ripple effect of how it's still influenced today, and that's Erna Phillips.
Yeah. It's so funny. Every time you bring up one, I'm like, oh, she's my favorite. No, she's my favorite.
Right. I can tell you, I can't. Yes. I loved your book so much.
Thank you.
Not just because of how you lay out the story, but also because of all of these amazing women. And I can't. Considering it's a book that I picked up because Betty White is in it, among just the title being inspirational.
That was our plan.
I knew it would be, right? To say, oh, the most lauded and favorite woman of the last decades or so, I can't choose between her and everyone else in this book who you've never heard of, who is my favorite.
I know. And the Betty stuff is great too, just because it's like, to me, we don't know a lot of that. Like, that's not what is emphasized because her career was so long. But anyway, Erna's fascinating. She invented soap operas. Like, she invented the entire genre. She was working in radio, and some guy was like, we need to get female listeners because we have to sell them these household products. Make something that they'll like. And she came up with essentially the family drama, right? Like, that's the serialized family drama is the way I would describe what she came up with as the soap opera. And, so she is the one who is responsible for like really a lot of the hallmarks, and weirdly that we still know about.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we all still kind of know about the dramatic organ cues. Which she came up with actually because she was doing Guiding Light at the time. And there's at that time, like, the central conceit of Guiding Light was actually a priest. So like the thing was more like she was thinking of organ cues, they're in church, great. And then it just stuck as a hallmark of all of her works. And she had so many works and they were so influential that everybody was doing it. So it just sort of became this actual trope that we still, I don't think anyone uses it, but we're still aware of it today as kind of like the cartoony version, right? And I think when they would do like the Californians on SNL, they would still use the stuff.
Yeah.
The other thing that they do in that she is very much responsible for is the dramatic pause. She loved a dramatic pause. When I was looking through her archives, she actually had often written on, like, when she gave notes to her directors, she'd be like, more dramatic pauses, please. She loved them.
The painter of television.
Even on radio, she started it on radio and then brought it to television. And, I think there's a number of reasons for that. And the thing is that she was so in touch with her female audience. And this sounds sexist now, but I actually think it's pretty clever, is that she was very focused on the fact that women who were watching at home would be doing housework. Mm-hmm. And while her fans from radio, like, that's fine. It's radio. We've all listened to podcasts while like doing housework, right? Mm-hmm. But she was very nervous about bringing it to television, even though she also believed it would work there. And she was always taking a lot of effort to like make sure, for instance, that they would explain like what was happening on the screen in the dialogue, so that you didn't have to necessarily like look up if you were in the other room or whatever, doing your ironing. Yeah. It's, or, so they look kind of dumb in a lot of ways. If they look dumb, that's why. It's because like, you're like, why are they saying, so they're like, I see you have a newspaper there and it's, and it says that so-and-so is wanted for murder.
They're just very observant back then. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. But that's why. And often too, like, she loved cliffhangers, but then would take pains to kind of explain, because they didn't, now or in more recent years, we came upon the brilliant idea of the recap, when you go like previously on. Mm-hmm. They didn't do previously on. So she would kind of have to, like, when she came back the next day, be like, well, as you know, Mita is wanted for murder. Oh. And
maybe you had like a doctor's appointment. Maybe you went out and got some groceries and you missed an episode too.
Yeah. So she just, because it was so important to this genre. This isn't a sitcom, right? So because in this genre, the whole point is knowing what's going on and wanting to find out what happens next, she figured out ways to make sure that that was really clear. And this made, in addition to this just being for women, all of these signals also made the men in the business think these were dumb. But she obviously had the last laugh and knew better. And it took a couple tries, but she ended up, with Guiding Light. I think this is brilliant too, is the trick ended up being, don't create a new show. When she created a new show for TV, it didn't work. She just brought her show over to television one day, like in the middle of the, same exact plot line, just brought it over to TV. And actually for a while they were doing both. So you could listen or watch depending on what your preferences were and what devices you had. And you would be hearing or watching the same show, like everybody was on the same page. So that was really brilliant too. So it wasn't as if they did like a new pilot to explain what was happening. They just were like, here we are on TV now, this is what's happening. And that really worked. And from there, she was sort of built this entire empire of soaps that were incredible. And she had 2 of the longest running television shows ever, including, I think it's Guiding Light. I think I'm getting this right. I don't have my book in
As
front
the
of me,
World
but
Turns, Another World.
yeah, but she had the actual,
the record.
She has the record for the longest running broadcast show ever, which encompasses its radio run. That's why it's the longest, because it goes back on radio. If you think about it, so many of those shows only ended recently.
Yeah. Not to mention, something that she was mentored to Agnes Nixon and William J. Bell. William J. Bell created Young and the Restless, which I grew up on, which is still on. Mm-hmm. So the fact that
Days of Our Lives,
that was if you want to talk about what raised me.
So the fact that a woman,
me too.
So the fact that a woman born in 1901 still has a reach to shows that are airing in 2024 is pretty spectacular.
It really is. And if you also think about a thing about soaps is that they've often been quite cutting edge. They're a place where things often happen first on television before primetime because people aren't paying as much attention. So they've had a lot of the first gay kiss and the first interracial and all of those kinds of things. They really have always, and just deal in very sort of taboo, racy topics. They've dealt with a lot of important issues too, like sexual assault and that kind of thing. And so if you think about that too, I mean, I think she would actually have a lot of mixed feelings about all of that. She had a lot of mixed feelings even in her time about the progressiveness of her own shows, which I think is very interesting. She was a single mother to 2 adopted children, and that was a huge reason I picked her, to be honest. I just thought that was fascinating. I didn't even know that could happen at that time. She ended up having a lot of regrets about it, and was very obsessed later in life with the fact that she had not been able to give her children a father figure, and actually even wrote about how she regretted making so many strong women on her shows. She felt personally responsible for rising divorce rates, which I say yay to you, but she saw it differently.
Do you think that maybe part of that was society putting that on her, or just being older and conservative?
I think it was. I mean, I think it was society. It's like there were no support systems for this kind of thing then. No one wanted this to happen. I mean, people were always saying things. Even, this is weird. I know you guys must know about this, that there's that archive of American television, all of these interviews. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's great. It's a great resource. And so they would just get people, and interview them about their entire history in television whenever they could get them, right? And so they're all more recent than, they're like in the last 20 or 30 years, they've all been done. And some of the people who worked with her, who were interviewed probably in the 90s or 2000s, just based on like what they look like and what the video quality looks like, would say things when they were asked about her, they'd say things like, well, she had 2 children under some very mysterious circumstances. I was like, is it mysterious, or did she adopt them, and is there paperwork? But you hear the implication there, right? Yeah. Like there's this very like nefarious, like no one. It's like, are you saying she was slutty? Are you like, I don't know what you're trying to say, but and I don't think it's those individual people even necessarily who like made this up, and it just was what they were told. Yeah, like this was how it was spoken of in general. Was like, well, I don't know where she got those kids. So, it's just very, it's very, very strange. I will say as a side note too, that I just think is so interesting. This is a huge reason that adoption is such a huge trope in soap operas. She put it in a lot and right away. She loved courtrooms. She had a number of legal issues in her life.
I was going to say, yeah.
And she loved adoption. And she put it in on purpose. And I think, and of course adoption also lends itself, right? It's family, it's mysterious, but she kind of pioneered those first big adoption stories, and like, who's the real, oh my God, I found out the real father is actually my boss at the hospital, and like that kind of thing. So, and that means that the guy I'm dating is actually my brother, and like all of that stuff. that so seems just like normal
Young
to
and the
us
Restless.
now.
I just feel like Maury owes her a thank you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
God.
she really did that, and she did put that stuff in on purpose, and she often was trying to say something with this stuff, and in time, at times with this was trying to tell people like, don't do it. I don't think it's a good idea. Like she really said she openly said she regretted having her children, which I don't think she meant against her children.
Yeah, she felt that she didn't give them a good life, I guess.
But it's so crazy because she was wealthy and successful, but she always felt like she was lacking. She was never felt like she was doing enough because the kids were going to school and the other mothers are baking brownies for, it's classic stuff for their kids to bring for their birthday. And she just couldn't, she had to have the nanny do it. And it really bugged her. And especially that lack of a father figure bugged her so much.
Yeah, that was a sad part for me when I read in the book.
Yeah. They had hard lives.
Yeah.
They really did.
Especially the representation of father figures is something we talk about a lot in a little show called Murphy Brown. Mm-hmm. Especially when we talk about being a kid and not quite knowing that it's a story being crafted for you or not. I, as a young person, was very confused by the Dan Quayle of it all when I was younger, as was Dan himself.
I mean, fair.
Yeah.
But I mean, we're obviously very curious about your experience with Murphy Brown, with the characters, the representation of a quote unquote older career woman.
Yes, that's a really good point. That's been a real axe I've been grinding lately, is because I have now reached middle age, that the representation of middle-aged women on television is just abhorrent. And we did better in the past. I think Maude came up recently too because of the death of Norman Lear. And it was like, we were doing it better before, to be honest. We had a number of shows like this. Murphy Brown is certainly one of them as well. And I do, because I was also a journalist, like I just remember loving this show for this reason of like, she's just so cool. I mean, she's just so cool.
She's the best.
There was just no getting around that, and we had kind of had like this lack of single women for a while. Right before that, we had kind of gone back in the 80s to so many traditional family things. And then even if they weren't traditional families, it was so male. It was like everything was silver spoons or different, right? A lot of weirdly single dads, mysteriously single dads, right? And so it was such a big deal, I think, at the time to kind of get this woman. And also just, I mean, she's so strong. And I think of like, I like to imagine her and like young Mary interacting, Mary Richards on the Mary Tyler Moore Show. Like, I think Mary would have been so into her, but also kind of very scared.
Oh, yes.
Very confused.
Now I have a fantasy that I didn't know I had before. I really wish we could see that, because like, that's just imagining like Mary being able to have an older female mentor in her business. Imagine if like a female equivalent of Lou Grant could have walked in that newsroom.
Oh, man.
Oh, that would have been great.
I do want that fan fiction now.
Right? Because Mary kind of gets there she definitely gets closer by the end. She is wearing power suits and like asserting herself a lot more by the end. And she has a cool apartment by the end. She's kind of a boss lady. But I don't think she ever quite got to the assertiveness level.
Well, and I'm curious
Murphy.
about if she could have, given when the show was airing. What was pushing the boundaries of the boss babe then
completely
versus the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Completely. I don't think you could. I mean, look at what happened to Murphy. Like, she ran into the vice president. Like, the vice president was mad at her, which I'm going to say is in a kind of, I think, a little bit spiritually similar to what we were saying about, say, the blacklisting of Hazel. Why did the vice president go after this specific woman? I don't think it was really about the pregnancy. I think it was, I don't want to say waiting. I don't think Dan Quayle, I mean, who knows? But I don't think Dan Quayle was like every week watching Murphy Brown and being like, how am I going to get her?
They did make a lot of Dan Quayle jokes. The first season, each episode has a Dan Quayle joke. And this was something
They really didn't like him.
we did not realize until we started the podcast and really sort of delving into it. And so, because we were so young when it happened, but
I didn't realize that either.
There is an idea that he kind of was angry at the show, let alone him mentioning this fictional woman in, you know, a speech about the riots. I mean, it's just, it's all ridiculous.
It is so, I mean, this had to be one of the most overtly political shows on at that time. Like now it doesn't feel weird to us, but then it was still a pretty big deal. Like now we expect every one of our shows to have, you know, to be either blue or red essentially. Whereas it's like I kind of want to just be like, you know, kids, it didn't used to, like, this really this was like a second coming of Norman Lear. This was, you know, really incendiary, clearly political, very obvious about how it felt about things. And, you know, things like women having, oh my God, children out of wedlock. Crazy.
Yeah, not knowing who the father was, as if
that's right.
That defines morality.
That too, right?
Right.
And then of course you have Rachel on Friends does the exact same thing, and there's not a peep out of anybody.
It's a really good point. It is really, that's so true that things had changed that much in that time. It didn't occur to me till you just said it, that could even be something that people could get upset about. So I'm glad that we had calmed down at least a little bit by then.
You know, we got there. And now, question, did we stay there? That's another conversation.
Right.
But here we are.
Here we are.
So a book that you have coming that seems to be quite well-timed. So Fetch.
It is weirdly well-timed. I have to tell, like, the secret is we didn't know it was quite this well-timed.
Oh, you didn't? Wow. What serendipity.
It's a little weird. We actually moved our date first before it was very weird. Anyway, neither here nor there. It's happening all concurrently. And yes, so my next book is about Mean Girls, the movie.
Thank you so much for joining us for part 1. We hope that you will join us for part 2, where we will continue our discussion on Mean Girls, the movie and the musical.
Yes, we had so much fun talking to Jennifer. We clearly could not keep it to one short episode. So we hope that you continue with us, continue riding the joy of television and pop culture and women.
Yes, and you can follow us on social media at Murphy Brown Pod. We have our website, murphybrownpod.com. You can drop us a line. Let us know what you think of this episode, other episodes, ideas for topics at murphybrownpod@gmail.com.
And we'll see you next time.